All right. Well, thank you all for having me here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Matt. I work with Save Our Youth Mentoring. We're a local mentoring organization. And specifically, we work with middle school and high school students who come from disadvantaged backgrounds. I know that right now, Altitude has been spending the last few weeks talking about mentoring, and that's why I'm here today. But before I jump into that, I want to spend some time looking at one of my favorite stories from the life of Jesus, which I think actually speaks a lot about the heart behind mentoring. So this morning, we're going to spend some time reading from the very last chapter of the book of John. It's chapter 21. You can read along with me if you'd like, just to kind of set up some context. Our story this morning begins after Jesus has already been crucified, buried, and risen from the dead. So jumping into John 21. Jesus appeared again to the disciples, this time at the Sea of Galilee. Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, the brothers Zebedee, and two other disciples were together. Simon Peter announced, "I'm going fishing." For those of you who don't know, Simon and Peter, they're the same guy, two different language of names here, but Simon and Peter are the same guy. So if you see one, same dude. The rest of them replied, "We're going with you." They went out and got in the boat. They caught nothing that night, but when the sun came up, Jesus was standing on the beach, but they didn't recognize him. Jesus spoke to them, "Good morning. Did you catch anything for breakfast?" And they answered, "No." Jesus said, "Throw the net off the right side of the boat and see what happens." They did what he said, and all of a sudden, there were so many fish in it, they weren't strong enough to pull it in. Then the disciple Jesus loved, that'd be John, said to Peter, "It's the master." When Peter realized that it was Jesus, he threw on some clothes, for he was stripped for work. As one does when going into work for the day. Peter was stripped for work. So he threw on his clothes, he dove into the sea. The other disciples came in by boat, for they weren't far from land, 100 yards or so, pulling along the net full of fish. So pause here. Right off the bat, you'll notice something if you know much about the life of Peter. This is almost the exact same story as when Peter and Jesus first met each other. Flashback just a couple years prior to the story this morning, in the very early stages of Jesus' public career. Jesus was teaching to crowds of people along the banks of the Sea of Galilee, the same exact place where today's story takes place. And because the crowds were pressing in and crowding him, Jesus asked Peter, a nearby fisherman, if he could hop into his boat in order to push out from shore just a bit so he could speak to the crowds without getting pushed into the sea. Once he had finished speaking, Jesus told Peter to throw his nets back into the water, to which Peter replied, "We've been fishing all night. We haven't caught a thing." But he obliged, and he threw his nets back into the water. He ended up catching such a huge amount of fish that his nets began to break. And Jesus told him then, "If you come follow me, I will make you a fisher of people." Essentially telling Peter that Jesus was going to make him a leader of sorts. So Peter leaves behind his boats, he leaves behind his nets, and he chooses to follow Jesus. So flash forward back to today's story. This is almost the exact same story. Once again, Peter and his friends have been fishing all night. They haven't caught a thing. Jesus walks up on the exact same shore where he and Peter first met years ago, and Jesus calls out again, "Try throwing your nets in one more time." And just like last time, they end up catching an enormous amount of fish, 153 this time, to be exact, at which point they realize that it's Jesus who's been calling out to them. Peter throws on his clothes, for he was stripped for work, and swims out to Jesus as fast as he can. And at first glance, this story maybe seems like a touching reunion story, as if Peter thought that Jesus was dead, and now he realizes that Christ is alive, he's resurrected, and Peter rushes out to greet him. But like most stories involving Jesus, I think there's actually a lot more going on here. From the way that John, the author of this biography of Jesus, from the way that John tells this story, Jesus has already appeared to the disciples after resurrecting. Peter has already, at this point in the story, Peter has already seen and met the resurrected Christ. And yet, for some reason, Peter is back where he started a few years ago, fishing with his friends in the Sea of Galilee. He's returned once more to the boats and the nets that he had abandoned years ago in order to follow Christ. But for some reason, Peter is back living his old life before he ever met Jesus. Not because he thought that Christ was dead and he had given up hope. Again, Peter knew that Jesus had risen from the dead. Rather, it seems that maybe Peter thought his chapter in the story of Jesus was over. Constantly throughout his time spent with Jesus, Peter made a fool of himself and then usually bounced back somewhat quickly. Maybe most famously, there's the story of Jesus walking on water, and Peter decides that he too could probably walk on water. He steps out of the boat. Shockingly, he doesn't get very far. Throughout the stories of Jesus, Peter is constantly running his mouth. He's writing checks that he's unable to cash. His eyes are bigger than his stomach. And on far more than one occasion, on most occasions, Peter makes a rash decision and ends up failing spectacularly. That's the story of Peter throughout the life of Jesus. Someone who makes rash decisions and fails. But Peter's greatest failure came at the very end of Jesus' life. Right before Jesus was about to be arrested and crucified by Roman soldiers, Jesus told Peter that he was about to be killed, and that Peter in the process would abandon him and disown him. Peter immediately assured Jesus, he said, "I will die with you before I ever disown you. I will die with you before I ever disown you." And those were the final words that Peter ever spoke to his master. Soon after this conversation, Jesus was arrested by Roman soldiers. Peter drew his sword. He cut off a man's ear in an attempt to fight for Christ. Jesus picked the ear up off the ground. He healed the man, and he scolded Peter, and he said, "How is it that you still don't understand what I'm doing?" And those were the final words spoken from Jesus to Peter. Jesus is then led away to be tried and ultimately executed by the state. Peter followed Jesus at a distance, and Jesus eventually ends up on trial. And so Peter found a charcoal fire on the outskirts of the trial, and he watched carefully from a distance as Jesus was humiliated and beaten and unfairly tried in the dead of night. And by the dim light of the fire, a young woman recognized Peter, saying that she recalled seeing him with Jesus at prior events. And Peter immediately denied ever knowing Christ. A second time, Peter was recognized. And then a second time, Peter denied ever knowing Jesus. And then finally, a third time, the people gathered around the fire pointed out that Peter's accent gave him away as one of the disciples of Christ. Peter cursed and swore that he did not know Jesus, nor had he ever known Jesus. And in that moment, Peter looked across the courtyard and he locked eyes with Jesus. His face was covered in blood and spit, swollen with bruises. Jesus looked into the eyes of Peter, and in that moment, Peter remembers the promise that he just made hours before. The promise that he would never disown Christ. And so Peter runs away from the courtyard. He weeps bitterly. And these are the final moments between Peter and Jesus. When his closest and dearest friend was suffering, Peter broke his promise. He disowned, he abandoned Jesus, a man who had only ever shown him love and kindness. And so now, a week or two later, Peter has given up. He's returned to a life of fishing. I think there's something deeply relatable and human about failing spectacularly and then returning to something comfortable as a result. And for Peter, this was being a fisherman. Peter goes back to the life that he had before he ever met Jesus, before he ever traveled around the Palestinian countryside with him. As far as Peter is concerned, he had failed Christ when it mattered most. And so now he's given up, and Peter has picked up his old life exactly where he left it. Peter starts over. But then Jesus, after resurrecting from death, shows up unexpectedly to start over with Peter. And Jesus recreates the exact circumstances under which he first met Peter and called him to be one of his disciples. So to recap, because I know we're jumping around a lot here. To recap, between these three stories, Jesus first met Peter at the Sea of Galilee, and he called him to be one of his disciples, to become a leader. And then, later on, towards the end of Jesus' life, Peter screwed up pretty terrifically and horribly. And out of an overwhelming sense of shame and defeat and failure, Peter gives up, picking up his old life right where he left it. But now the resurrected Jesus shows up and meets Peter back at square one. He calls out to him in the exact same way that he did at the very beginning of their friendship. All right, so jumping back into John 21. When Simon Peter realized that it was Jesus, he threw on some clothes, for he was stripped for work, and dove into the sea. The other disciples came in by boat, for they weren't far from land, 100 yards or so, pulling along the net full of fish. When they got out of the boat, they saw a fire laid with fish and bread cooking on it. Jesus said, "Bring some of the fish you've caught." Simon Peter joined them and pulled the net to shore, 153 fish. And even with all those fish, the net didn't rip. Jesus said, "Breakfast is ready." Not one of the disciples dared ask, "Who are you?" because they knew it was Jesus. Jesus then took the bread and gave it to them. He did the same with the fish. I just want to pause here really quick for a second. This doesn't have anything to do with anything else I'm going to say, but I think there's something so human and tender about this little detail. Not only does the resurrected Jesus walk and talk, but he cooks breakfast for his friends, which I think is just so sweet. One of the greatest gifts in this life is a home-cooked meal that you did not pay for and you did not prepare. And Jesus, I imagine, surely quite busy with lots of post-resurrection business to take care of, Jesus takes the time to start a fire, fry up some fish for his friends so that they can enjoy a surprise breakfast after a long, frustrating night of work. What a nice friend. Okay, so continuing, back in John 21, after breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Master, you know I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Then he asked a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Master, you know I love you." Jesus said, "Shepherd my sheep." Then he said it a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved that he asked for the third time, "Do you love me?" So he answered, "Master, you know everything there is to know. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." So now, after having finished breakfast, sitting around the fire, Jesus begins to question Peter. And just like the last scene, which was a reboot of sorts of the very first time Peter and Jesus met, this next scene now, eating breakfast on the shore, is a reboot of the very last time that Peter and Jesus ever saw each other. If you recall, it was around a charcoal fire. It was sitting around a fire that Peter denied knowing Jesus 3 times after being questioned by strangers. And now, sitting around a fire, once again, Jesus is the one questioning Peter. And he gives him the opportunity to redeem himself by asking him 3 times, "Do you love me?" And Peter realizes exactly what Jesus is doing. John writes that Peter was grieved that Jesus asked him 3 times. He knows, he understands that Jesus is giving him a second shot at getting things right after having failed so miserably last time. He understands that Christ is giving him a chance to affirm his love 3 times as a way to directly confront and defeat his past failure of disowning Jesus 3 times. And this is really important to note here. Jesus doesn't just ask Peter, "Do you love me?" and then forgive him. Instead, he reaffirms Peter's calling. He tells him, "Feed my sheep." From the very first time they met, Jesus told Peter that he saw him as a leader. And Peter's failure hasn't changed that fact. Jesus is reiterating to Peter here that he still views him the same. He's reminding Peter that his value hasn't changed, despite his flaws, despite his failures. Jesus still sees and believes Peter to be a leader. And there are clearly a lot of things we can talk about in this story. We don't have enough time today, but for our purposes, I think we can point out a couple really important things here. First off, faith is not linear. A life of faith and devotion is full of ups and downs and failures and successes. Faith is an extremely difficult and complex thing. Trying to fully, completely, exhaustively comprehend and grasp humanity's relationship to the divine is far from simple. And that's okay. Peter had completely given up and started over with his life. And so Jesus started it over with him. When we walk away from our faith, God walks with us. Jesus does not tell Peter, hey, I'll be here whenever you decide to come back. No, Jesus follows Peter back to the very beginning, and Jesus starts over completely from scratch, even when Peter had completely given up. Faith is not a linear thing. And if you feel like you're starting over, or if it feels like you've taken a step back, just know that Jesus is still taking that step back with you. When we walk away, God walks with us. Even when we give up completely, God, I think from this story, we can see that God starts over from the beginning with us. It very well might be that last week you sat in this room with confidence in your faith, certainty in your beliefs. And maybe this week you're no longer sure about anything that you believe. That's okay. Faith is not a linear process. If you're here this morning because you believe in God, that's great. You are welcome in this space. If you're here just because you like the music, that's great. You are welcome in this place. If you're here this morning out of nothing more than a sense of obligation or a commitment to the rhythm of being in this room on Sundays, that's great too. I don't work here at Altitude Church. I'm just a guest speaker. But knowing the pastors here, I can say with full confidence that you are welcome and accepted here just as you are. Faith is a complex process with lots of ups and downs, and God is with you throughout the whole process. And this community is here with you throughout the whole process. So first, faith is not linear. And then second, you are not beyond redemption or restoration, regardless of what you have done, what you've said, who you've hurt, or who you've been hurt by. You are not beyond the scope of restoration and redemption. No one is. By giving Peter 3 chances to affirm his love, Jesus gives Peter the opportunity to redeem himself in a way that directly confronts and defeats the prior ways in which Peter had failed. Jesus takes the tragic failures of Peter's past and he brings them into the light so that Peter might be restored. The sweeping theme of resurrection, of Easter, is that of hope. Hope that death and pain do not have the final word. Hope that the dark places of this world may yet still be redeemed, and hope that the dark places in our hearts, like Peter's, may too be exposed and brought into the light so that life can flourish. Deeply woven into the very core of our shared faith is the hope that darkness can become light, that failures can be overcome, that restoration and redemption is yet still possible for every single one of us. We are stubbornly hopeful. We refuse to accept that darkness is to be the expectation of our lives. Yes, there is brokenness all around us, but we believe that there is also joy all around us, that there is beauty to be discovered, divinity to be encountered, restoration to be granted. And in the case of Peter in this story, redemption from failures is not just some form of like abstract forgiveness. When Jesus restores Peter and forgives Peter, he also reaffirms his value and his potential. Jesus does not respond to Peter's "I love you" with a simple "I forgive you." Jesus responds to Peter's "I love you" with a task: feed my sheep. He restores Peter's value and potential even when Peter had given up and Peter had saw and Peter saw no value left in himself. Jesus still saw Peter's true potential. And Jesus sought to restore Peter to that reality. I think that in part is why faith communities like this one matter. It is our job as a community to restore those who have wounds, whether self-inflicted or inflicted by others. It is so important to surround yourself with people who see and know the value that you hold, so that when, not if, but when, you feel defeated and want to give up, there are people in your life ready to stay by your side and remind you of your true value and your true worth. May this be a community that embodies the hope of the resurrected Christ and is constantly, unwaveringly committed to reaffirming, redeeming, and restoring the brokenhearted. And that brings me to the other reason why I'm here this morning, besides just giving the pastors a break from teaching. Like I said earlier, I work for a local nonprofit organization. We're called Save Our Youth Mentoring. We were founded in Denver about 30 years ago, and what we do is simple. We connect young people to hope through long-term mentoring relationships. Specifically, what that means is we work with middle school and high school students in the community who are disadvantaged and struggling, whether emotionally, socially, academically, financially, and we find volunteer mentors for these teens. Someone who can walk alongside of these young people one-on-one and give them hope and direction and purpose. Let's think back for just a minute about the relationship between Jesus and Peter. Jesus saw value and potential in Peter that Peter could not see in himself. Jesus gave Peter a sense of purpose and direction in his life. Jesus helped Peter overcome his failures and move past his mistakes in life. Jesus put up with Peter. Even when he was being stubborn and difficult, Jesus showed Peter love and hope and forgiveness. So let me ask you all a question. Think back to a time in your life when you were younger. This is not a hypothetical question. Really, think back in your life when you were a teenager. Did you have an older person in your life who helped you see your value, your potential, even if you couldn't fully see it yourself? Someone who helped you find purpose and direction, someone who helped you overcome failures and mistakes, someone who put up with your nonsense when you were being difficult and stubborn, maybe a teacher, a coach, a youth pastor, a family friend. That's what it means to be a mentor to somebody. The truth is there are young people in this community who are growing up in a confusing and chaotic and divided world without any mentors to guide them and walk with them. And when I say this community, I mean this community. I want all of you to listen carefully to what I'm about to say here. We have students on our wait list. Students who've signed up to receive a mentor who have been coming to this church regularly for lunch on Wednesdays. There are students at Arvada High School who have come to this church building to eat lunch on Wednesdays who have asked Save Our Youth to find them a mentor. So I'm here to ask one very simple, direct thing. Can you be a mentor? Can you make the commitment of investing in the life of one of these young people, one-on-one? Regardless of your age, your personality, your occupation, I really do believe that there is a kid out in the community right now who would benefit so much if you made the commitment of being their mentor today. Maybe even one of the kids who's already in this building once a week from Arvada High School. If any of this is speaking to your heart or just hitting you in a certain way, please connect with one of the staff here at Altitude, or you can go to saveouryouth.org where you can learn more about becoming a mentor with the program. For those of you who are in the room this morning, we're going to be having a lunch after service where you can learn more about mentoring, learn more about Save Our Youth, ask some questions. I want to invite you all to be a part of that. And just one final closing thought. Think about the person that Peter eventually became after his encounters with Jesus. We've talked about who Peter was. Peter was this guy who who acted impulsively and screwed up a lot and made rash decisions and didn't think things through. That's kind of who Peter is at the beginning of his story with Jesus. But think about who Peter came after his encounters with Jesus. Peter went on to become the pastor of the very first church in history. Peter either wrote or helped write several books of the Bible, including a couple of the Gospels of Jesus. Imagine the potential that every young person in our community holds and what a difference it makes for them to have a caring mentor in their life. Thank you all.
Hey there, my name's Gage. I'm the worship leader here at Altitude, and I just wanted to say thanks for being here. We love spending this time together every week, but this is just a small part of what we do as a community on a weekly basis. And if you are interested in being a part of that community in a deeper, maybe more tangible way, then I got some links down below that you can check out right now. That first one is going to be a Plan Your Visit link. And what you do, click that, fill out the digital form. That lets us know that you are going to be here so we can prepare to host you well. The second one's going to be life groups. That is the lifeblood of this community. If you're looking to get to know some people and be known by those people and know God together, that's going to be where to go. That third link, that's the calendar. Go there, see what we've got going on outside of Sunday mornings. Come be a part of what we've got going on outside of Sunday mornings. We love to host our town. We love going out into the town. So see where we'll be, see what we're doing. You're invited. And then lastly, that fourth link, that's going to be the giving link. You know, we are a not-for-profit organization, so anything that you give there goes right back into the community. But we are very serious and very passionate about giving to the community. So if you want to partner with us financially in that way, or even just give a one-time gift, that's the link there, and thank you in advance. But we've had a good time being together today. So glad that you could be a part of it, and we hope to be seeing much more of you in the future here at Altitude Church. Have a great week. We'll see you next time.